Alright, so this is episode 1 of the Cloudy Skies podcast. I'm CloudHop,
I'm Open Skies.
and we're going to talk about operating systems, because I use Windows, and Open uses Linux.
And we have some opinions about that, and we both have some bad experiences in the other's OS. And we have some funny stories about it that we would like to tell.
So, who's gonna go first?
Oh. Well, I feel like I should do the classic stereotypical reverse complaints, because for me, on Windows, audio and Wi-Fi reliably don't work. Now, I know there's a big meme to say that those things don't work on Linux, but no, seriously, they don't work on Windows. I have had several Windows machines that just reliably have them broken. Like, my current laptop came from the original equipment manufacturer with Windows installed, with broken Wi-Fi drivers. I needed to install Linux in order to get a working Wi-Fi card on it. And, this isn't a super obscure laptop. Like, it even had a sticker advertising that it had a recent generation cutting-edge Ethernet and Wi-Fi card for better network performance during gaming. And then it just didn't work on Windows.
But it did say it was for Windows, right?
Right, yeah. Like, Windows, the operating system that everyone uses for gaming, except for, weirdos like me who have put in the effort to beat things into submission so that they work on Linux.
Yeah, I've obviously never heard of a laptop shipping completely broken, at least not within my circle of friends, but I have at least heard anecdotal stories that occasionally this happens with some really shitty laptop distributors.
Yeah.
Which is impressive.
Yeah. And the laptop before that also had a weird flaky Wi-Fi driver that was broken on Windows, but not on Linux. Well, not completely broken. It would work at first. And then, after roughly 24 hours of uptime, randomly, the Wi-Fi would get laggy and then stop connecting. And nothing I could do, including reinstalling the driver, would make the Wi-Fi work again until I rebooted.
Well, reinstalling the driver isn't going to do anything until you reboot the machine anyway.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that kind of makes sense. It probably had, a memory leak.
Yeah, but, what? Test your drivers!
That is not Microsoft's fault, to be fair.
Yes, sure, it is not Microsoft's fault. However, with the whole closed source ecosystem means that no one who has the issue can actually go in and fix it, and the manufacturer clearly doesn't care, because otherwise there would have been an update at some point over the years that I had that laptop that made the problem stop happening.
There are such things as open source Windows drivers. It's just that companies hate you.
Yes, they're rare. Yeah, companies hate you. Yeah. Yeah, like the ext2 driver in Windows. That's open source and quite nice, actually.
So, you say that it's a meme that the Wi-Fi and the audio never works in Linux, and I have had some routing issues with audio in Linux. But in general, when I was using Linux, audio really never was my issue. My issue was things like I need it to boot.
Right, yeah.
Which
it's a freaking graphics drivers.
Most of the time it was the graphics drivers. Sometimes it was literally it just didn't work. The worst one I think was I was trying to install a light version of Ubuntu that had a bunch of stuff stripped out.
Oh no, Ubuntu is a bad idea for reliable things.
And everyone told me the exact opposite all the time because this was
they were liars.
2009. um, and the installer crashed,
Yeah.
which was hilarious. I think at one point I managed to get Linux Mint installed.
Oh yeah, Linux Mint is not terrible. Though I have actually had the Windows installer crash on me before.
That I have never seen in my life. How would you manage that one?
So I had a laptop that I had just completely wiped Windows off of because wanted Linux on it and the Windows was just so totally broken. But I wanted to get Windows or dual boot Windows 10 onto it, in order to actually use some Windows applications I needed for that. So I repartitioned it from Linux and then tried to set up the Windows installer to have and to use the existing OEM key registered in the BIOS, plus a partition I made from Linux. And the installer just failed and crashed.
Yeah, it probably didn't like the whole Linux thing. Or Linux did something
Yeah.
wrong and nobody cared except Microsoft or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah,
It's always
I
a
don't
bad
know.
idea to mix those. As
But
I found out that one time. But like even before I get to that story, I remember like my primary issue was the graphics drivers because before I had the it can't boot problem, I did manage to get like a working version of Mint installed on one of my machines in like 2008. But the problem is that I was forced to use the like Novio open source drivers, whatever they're called.
Nouveau.
Novo, with like too many vowels.
It's from a French word for the genre of Art Nouveau.
Fuck the French spelling. I hate French. English needs to stop taking French words. Anyway,
No, English refuses.
someone needs to stop English.
Yeah, English is three languages in a trench coat, and you get to deal with it. Ever since 1080 AD with the invasion from we get all kinds of fun things that no other language has, like the pig and pork. A bunch of the words in English for animal and food from the animal come from different languages and different linguistic traditions. Like the animal comes from the Germanic language family that the peasants spoke, and the food comes from the Romance language family that the invading nobles spoke.
I think I heard about that actually. But anyway, when I'm not complaining about English, I'm complaining about the fact that my GPU fans are on 100% all the time, which was mostly just annoying for a while, except after I noticed that my computer would stop booting correctly after running Linux for long periods of time. This would only happen if I was running Linux. It would only happen if it was for like several hours, and it would go away if I turned off the computer and left it there for like 10 minutes. And so I became terrified that Linux was melting my CPU.
Oof.
Which at this point may have actually been happening. I don't really know. So I uninstalled Linux Mint.
When I used Ubuntu back in the 2000s, because I was a young pony and didn't know any better, I had a problem with the NVIDIA drivers and the Nouveau drivers and the packaging. So I had an NVIDIA GPU because NVIDIA, at the time at least, just had the best GPU performance, and it had CUDA, and I kind of needed that for doing computer vision stuff. At some point, I ran an update in Ubuntu, unsuspecting, because, hey, it's Ubuntu. It's really supposed to be reliable about those updates. And the update stomped on the driver configuration and installed the Nouveau driver, despite me having blacklisted it. And so then when it booted, instead of just picking one between the NVIDIA and the Nouveau driver, it tried to load both, resulting in it being unable to do anything with the GPU. And so whenever anything GUI tried to load, it just black screen and hang.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Very close, actually, to what happened to me.
Yeah. I did actually manage to get out of that by using hotkeys to switch into terminal mode as it boots, so that it booted into a kernel frame buffer terminal rather than loading a display manager. And then I used the terminal web browser that I had installed, because why not? And looked up about it, and then I manually fixed the package installation and reconfigured the OS and rebooted, and it worked. It only took me like 4 or 5 hours to fix this problem. That should never have happened.
Yeah, it sounds like when Ubuntu destroyed SweetieBot's database twice.
Oh, yeah. I remember those incidents. Those were fun war stories.
But, like, Ubuntu has this insane thing where they just break all the GPU drivers, because, like, the issue that I ran into was I got the NVIDIA drivers installed properly, like the proprietary ones that were correct, and everything worked fine until I updated the system, and then Ubuntu uninstalled the GPU drivers and resorted to the CPU rasterizer LLVM pipe in order to do anything. And the thing is that it still thought the drivers were installed, even though they were obviously gone at that point. And it wouldn't let me uninstall them. And if I force uninstalled them and tried to reinstall them, it didn't do anything. So the whole system was just stuck in this state of using the CPU rasterizer to draw everything. At which point I think I just uninstalled Linux and never touched it for another 4 years.
Yeah. Well, fortunately, we have better tech now, what with Nix and Nixos, where we actually have rollbackable things and declarative configuration that is pure and functional, and so it will not break in any of these ways. And if it somehow does break or you make a mistake, you can just hit the down arrow at the boot screen to say, load the previous generation from before I broke it, please.
Yes. Yeah. Which would have been handy for that other distro that I tried. I forget which one it was. I think it was Fedora, where I tried to do the same thing, and it was working fine, and then I installed the NVIDIA drivers, and the system couldn't boot. Which was an impressive level of broken.
Yeah. Though now I feel it's time for me to talk about Windows some more. The audio control panel in Windows is so bad.
Yes.
The UX is just awful. Besides having the settings needed in 3 different styles, they're just, the controls that I actually want to use don't exist. On Windows, something I fairly regularly use is routing audio from different applications to different outputs. As one does. That's what you do with audio. You have an application output to something. And so, something I like to do with that is, say if I invite someone over to my room to watch a video with me, and I want to point the browser window that's playing the video at the desktop speakers, but leave everything else going to my headphones. That's really easy to do on Linux. It's just, with Pavo Control, it's just one dropdown. I am hopeful that it can be made even easier in the future as Pipewire matures and gets better GUIs. But in Windows, that control just doesn't exist.
Well,
whenever
unless you install
yeah.
the special virtual audio cable thing.
Right. And so when I have to ask Cloud for help for fixing Windows audio issues, like you just disable all of the outputs you don't want and then restart some programs, and then they pick up the output you want, which is just that's not what I want to do. I want to point the program at the output. I don't want to have to disable all of the other outputs than the one I want the one program to go to, because there are still other programs I want to go to those outputs.
Yeah, but like in Windows you get audio. So
Not in my experience.
And some people have had difficulty. I've actually seen people, like other people's laptops, have extreme difficulty getting the audio to work because usually they're not able to use the Pipewire. They're using something else.
Pulse was the older version, or was the older default system.
Yeah, it was like Pulse.
There have been several Linux audio systems,
and they all suck except for the Pipewire.
Yeah. We've got Jack and Pulse as the two previous primary ones, where Jack would let you have all the control over everything, but it didn't usually work the first time, but it was possible to fix. And then there's Pulse, which usually works the first time and is impossible to fix when it doesn't.
That actually sounds a lot like, I remember some people having issues with that, where it was like they could fix it once and then it would happen again, and then like I'd just go home because it would never get fixed.
Right, yeah.
So yeah, that was always a pain in the ass. And I mean, I guess my primary issue with Linux was always just that I couldn't get it to work. So it didn't really like. There's a bunch of other complaints I had about Linux though. Like I remember when I was using Linux Mint, and this still happens to this day, where like Linux hates user interfaces. It's allergic to making user interfaces. All of its user interfaces are just incredibly thin layers over command line calls or scripts or whatever, and they just don't care about the details. So they're like, hey, look, I drew a line. And they don't care about the fact that sometimes the line doesn't render at random on the start menu, or one of their fonts is slightly off somehow and they're like cutting off 3 pixels of it or something. Like, so many random tiny little rendering errors that just bug the crap out of me every single time I see them. And Linux is like, well, it works, right? Do you have any idea how hard it was to make that work? And I'm like, do you understand like how bad that is? It should not be so difficult to draw text on the screen that you have no time left to make it work consistently. That just means that everything you're doing is painstaking for all the wrong reasons. It's like, sometimes I feel like writing programs for Linux is Nintendo hard. It's hard for the wrong reasons.
I feel the same way about Windows, oddly enough.
Well, it depends on what you're doing.
But like, the amount of steps I've needed to do to get a C compiler on Windows every time I try to build something on Windows is just awful.
What the fuck are you doing? There's one step to getting a C compiler on Windows. It's called install Visual Studio. Now you have a C compiler.
But see, I wanted to get a command line C compiler.
There is a command line C compiler.
The internet tells me that it's possible to download, that it was at some point possible to download Microsoft Visual C on Windows without needing to install all 12 gigabytes of Visual Studio.
They were lying to you. Well, okay, I don't know if they were lying to you, but like, it sure is fucking easy to get that to work.
Yeah. Yes,
Like-
I know.
As you found out.
Right.
But like, like, a lot of times, a lot of the issues that happen with Windows are with Linux. You have to deal with things a certain way, and you just kind of have to put up with it, and you generally end up having to learn the systems in order to debug them. Whereas with Windows, you learn how to deal with general Windows being silly issues, which is like, if the program doesn't work, uninstall and reinstall it, or if, like, you want your C compiler, you just install all of Visual Studio and you don't trust that anyone can actually get a working subset of it. And then everything will work if you stay in the happy path. But on Linux, there isn't a happy path. It just breaks somehow. Because on Linux, a happy path doesn't exist, since it has to care about all the different hardware configurations and everything else that Windows manages to abstract under $1 billion. So...
Not sure I agree with you there. Because I've had a lot of experience with happy path stuff on Linux. And I have had Windows fuck me up royally repeatedly.
I don't know. I've never had a happy path on Linux. Everything's gone wrong. Like, everything has always gone wrong somehow when I want to do the most basic things.
Yeah.
But sometimes
but
on
now
Linux...
I'm here, so...
Okay, but like, you don't solve this by fixing Linux. You solve this by using Nix, which then undoes 50% of how Linux worked and was like, wow, that was a bad idea. Let's do something completely different. And then people are like, hey, look, Linux works now. I'm like, well... Yes, you changed how most of it works, so it does work now, but that's like a completely different operating system at that point.
Yes, like, we need new operating systems.
Yes, but I'm not disputing that. I'm saying that traditional Linux distros are utter trash. And the reason there is no native Nix on Windows is because Nix relies on systemd.
That's just Nixos, I believe. I don't think Nix itself relies on systemd. Otherwise, it wouldn't run on Mac OS, which uses LaunchD instead of systemd because they wrote their own thing in house. Then there's also Nix runs on non-systemd Linuxes.
Then I don't know what the problem is. There's some other probably Nixisms that they're relying on. I don't know.
Yeah.
Someone like Elrider wrote the code, and it's like all fucking
I doubt that.
specific bullshit. Oh, you do? You wanna bet? I've seen the worst fucking code in these Linux distros, I swear to God.
Yeah, me too. There is so much awful code in the world.
There is an endless stream of awful code being generated 24/7 for free.
Yes.
Everywhere you want to get it. Usually on Stack Overflow. But anyway.
So, once upon a time, I was trying to use Lua lanes on Windows, which was... So someone wrote a multi-threading library for Lua that, well, it behaved a little bit like Go, where you had channels and you could... have shared buffers and yada yada yada. So, this was super easy to build on Linux. Like, worked the first try. Trying to get it to work on Windows, oh boy, that was an exercise in frustration. Because, like, getting a C compiler that would consent to build this code was a challenge. Like, just getting MSVC was difficult, and then getting it to accept a makefile was difficult, And then,
Why the
oh hey,
fuck
turns
are you
out
trying
that
to get?
Windows decided to use a completely different flavor of make than everything else does,
No, no,
and
no,
I
no, no.
need to.
Windows does not accept make files. It just doesn't. They're not make files. It's called like MS build or like MS make files. Like
And
they're
make.
nmake or
It's
whatever.
nmake. It accepts make files. It just uses. It just doesn't accept, or they're just a different dialect. Like a lot of the syntax is the same, confusingly so. The fucking naming and syntax and extensions are the same, but they have different semantics, and that was just absolutely infuriating to me at the time.
Well, it's because it's not make. Like nmake
Yeah,
is just
like
is different. Like it's related to make. It may have been inspired by make, but it's not make. Windows does not support make files. You need to use CMake, not nmake or
correct.
anything else. It won't work. And if you try using MS Build, God help you, don't do that.
Oh yeah, manually invoking MS build was it was a mistake. I have done that. It was a mistake.
Yes. But yeah, now you just use CMake and invoke things that
Yeah.
way.
I don't believe that package had a CMake list though.
Well, you had to make one then. It
Yeah.
didn't support Windows. That's it. It just doesn't support Windows. If it doesn't have a
But,
CMake package, it doesn't support Windows. If it doesn't ship some way of compiling on Windows that's not completely batshit insane, it doesn't support Windows.
But like the internet told me that Windows could build make files using nmake, and the internet told me,
Oh my
oh,
god.
there's just this or pthreads.h header that adapts the POSIX threading calls to the Windows threading API and just lets you run pthreads code on Windows. And the internet told me yada yada yada.
So the internet lied to you a whole lot.
Yes.
That pthreads
Well,
thing
the
exists.
internet lied to you a lot too.
Well, I mean, it was more than that. I got a lot of. It wasn't just the internet. Trust me.
Yeah.
But one of the issues is that the pthreads thing is actually part of MinGW and or MingW if you want to call it that, whatever. And that's a favorite way of people saying of Linux people being like, here's my Linux project that only runs on Linux that supports Windows because I support MingW. And I'm like,
but not really.
that doesn't work because
I haven't tried to build it in MingW this year, but don't think about that.
well, it'll usually build, but this is utterly useless because it's fundamentally not Windows. What it does is it literally builds the executable as if it was on Linux, but then has an interface layer to the actual Microsoft C runtime. And this is important because they don't implement the Microsoft C API. So all of your functions are completely incompatible with actual Windows functions. So you don't have a Windows app. You don't have anything that can interact with a Windows app. You have a Linux app in a trench coat on Windows. And the Linux people don't care because they're like, well, it's Windows. If you want good support, switch to Linux. And then I'm like, well, my computer doesn't work with Linux. And they're like, well, that's your fault. And then I get really mad.
Well, yeah, clearly you shouldn't have bought an NVIDIA card. Ha ha ha.
Yeah, like way back when AMD didn't know how to make fucking graphics cards or like graphics card drivers. I had a laptop when it was in like, God, that was 2007, 2006, very long time ago. I had a really old laptop. It had Windows 7 on it. It used to have that laptop was made for Windows XP, and I managed to get Windows 7 on it, and wasn't happy about that. And it had an AMD card in it because it was a laptop with fucking Catalyst drivers that were the worst goddamn drivers I've ever seen in my life. Like, just, oh my god, it was a nightmare. And those drivers just dragged that laptop into the ground. And I think I actually found a legitimate bug in them, which is really funny because at the time I was trying to build my 2D graphics engine. And that card just didn't do something in particular. I think it got like the vertex winding wrong in some case, which was impressive.
How do you fuck that up and not notice?
I don't know, but like all the texture coordinates were wrong, and I had to like compensate for it. Like I had an actual like workaround in the engine. I forget what it was, but like there was an actual workaround in the engine where the driver just did the wrong thing, and I'm like, ah, yes, AMD graphics cards. And yeah, ATI, it wasn't AMD. Sorry, I have literally forgotten that ATI existed because AMD ate them, and all of my memories of them are that they made bad graphics cards. And then you get an NVIDIA card, and the Linux people are like, well, NVIDIA is terrible, so you don't get to use it on Linux. And I'm like, okay, but I need a graphics card that works. And they're like, well, you just have to suffer for the sake of open source software. Frothing at the mouth, new whatever shit. I don't know. I'm so sick of the GPL.
Yeah, I am so annoyed at Sway. Yeah, double dash, my next graphics card won't be NVIDIA if you want to launch the window manager on an NVIDIA card.
What the fuck?
Yeah, seriously. Now, to be fair, that flag is born of annoyance from NVIDIA not fucking implementing the standard protocol and demanding that they write their own version of it, and then just not.
So, to be fair, NVIDIA... Okay, so like NVIDIA like to torture Linux people on purpose, but
yeah.
Sometimes what happened is that NVIDIA would introduce a new GPU feature and then just not really care about the OpenGL support for that feature and expect people to use their vendor-specific extensions for that feature because they invented it or whatever.
Yeah.
We have that right now because NVIDIA invented mesh shaders, which are really cool. Guess what?
Yeah.
They're only in it.
I am so excited to actually write mesh shaders and to have mesh shader support in Feather. We are going to make some awesome demos of that.
They are NVIDIA only. There is no standard way of accessing a mesh shader in existence right now.
The VKNV mesh extension, yeah.
So this would happen all the time because like 90% of the OpenGL extensions are just NVIDIA extensions that were normalized because NVIDIA made it first. And the people making OpenGL were running around being complete idiots for like 10 years.
Yeah.
Which
is money.
I mean, sort of, kind of, but like also just them being stupid, like just incredible amounts of incompetence. Like, I remember AWR here is like, oh, you found a bug in a graphics driver? And of course, that's like a joke now because we all know that graphics cards are chock full of drivers. But like, I remember when I was
drivers.
Sorry, drivers are chock full of bugs. Not bugs are chock full of drivers. That would be no. GPU drivers right now are chock full of bugs. And the Nintendo Switch people, the Nintendo Switch user emulator people will tell you all about that.
Oh boy, I remember those stories.
Yeah.
You'd really... I wish someone had actually made a machine-readable Quirks database.
Yes, because you need it. And I mean, this came up with Halo Infinite and all that other stuff. But like, when I was like 16 or 17, writing a graphics engine and working on my own code, people would always be like, don't worry, it's never a driver issue, or don't worry, it's never a compiler bug. And then I'd run into fucking driver bugs and compiler bugs. And they're like, wow, that's unusual. And I'm like, am I the only one doing anything? I don't understand. Other people must have...
Genuinely, yes. You and I are some of the only people that I know of that are actually trying these weird corner cases and things to actually build new things that are weird.
it's just it was really frustrating because it's like everyone else either ignored it or didn't run into it somehow because they were like in a happy path or something like that.
Yeah.
Or something else abstracted it away from them. And I think that happened a lot where it was like nobody paid attention to what was actually going on. SDL would abstract it all away, and someone else would implement all of these core workarounds. And then, they just tell you, yeah, see, everything works fine, being completely oblivious to all the work going on under the hood to make everything appear fine for them.
Yeah.
This is
See,
fine.
you shouldn't have
JPG.
looked under the hood. That's how you get to be happy.
Yeah, don't look under the hood.
Ignorance is bliss.
Oh man, it's just so many people over the years very confidently being wrong repeatedly.
Yeah.
Like telling me how garbage collection was fine and it's not going to be a performance issue. And boy, we're still paying for that one.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would have all of these, these kinds of issues would crop up with Linux and at least on Windows. Honestly, I think it's because, especially in the early days, Windows benefited a lot from Microsoft having fuck tons of money to throw at commonly used hardware to make it work correctly, even though nobody was writing decent drivers, and then the Linux people were just left out to dry.
Yeah. But then it's also been sort of the reverse where Linux people can actually fix problems and Windows people are, yeah. When a company doesn't care, Windows people are left out to dry, whereas Linux people can sometimes actually fix the problem. And so it's a bit of a double-edged sword there.
But it really depends. Like, if a company doesn't want you editing their code, then you're kind of screwed.
Yeah, thanks NVIDIA for open sourcing your stuff, finally.
It only took them 20 years.
Yeah. And, it's fascinating because, looking at 2 hours after that issue or after that repo dropped on GitHub, you could already look at it and see people combing through the code and saying, hey, I ran a linter tool and found that you don't actually check the origin of a buffer here or the size of a buffer here and have a buffer overrun exploit possible. And
yeah, because everything is broken by default.
Right. But they open sourced it and instantly got free eyes debugging their code just for the heck of it. Imagine how much better everything could have been if they had just started collaborating with Linux.
No, that's not true. But that's not true. People looked over the source because it was NVIDIA. If what you are saying actually happened, Heartbleed never would have existed.
I mean, yeah, well...
Because nobody looked at the code. No one knew what the fuck OpenSSL was doing, or OpenSSH.
This was OpenSSL.
OpenSSL, yeah.
Yeah, nobody it was a bug in the TLS implementation.
Yeah, and to this day, OpenSSL is total insanity because it was architected by some guy in his basement, and they've just kind of been trying to unfuck it since then.
Yeah.
I
am annoyed at OpenSSL still. We have Libsodium now, and Libsodium makes all of this cryptography super freaking easy. It just provides all of the cryptographic primitives that I actually want to use, and it gives me a way to do them. It gives me an opinionated way to look at it, so that I can pick the best cryptographic operation to perform this primitive by default, and it makes it hard for me to mess up, and easy for me to do it. And it's awesome. And I am really frustrated that the TLS implementations can't let me get to that same level of convenience.
Yeah, but like
And
sometimes we get lucky and sometimes we don't.
right.
Where like cuz I mean, we still have constant security issues in the Linux kernel, like really dumb
Yeah.
ones.
Oh yeah.
Ones
And
that
like
should be caught by static analysis, but apparently nobody runs the Linux kernel through static analysis, possibly because it's too big. I don't know.
yeah,
So like you
like
have
we
all these
have really good
people.
fuzzer tech nowadays actually, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, but we're not using it.
We are using it sometimes.
But not on the Linux kernel.
I think parts of the Linux kernel have been fuzzed.
Okay, but like they keep finding security bugs where some guy allocated a
Yeah.
thing after subtracting one from a value that he didn't check so it can overflow. That keeps happening. It's gonna drive me crazy every single goddamn time. Oh my god.
Yeah. Well, we just need to build our own operating system on SEL4.
Yes. We have to do a
Yes.
whole episode on SEL4 and capabilities and why it's
Oh yeah,
way
capability.
better.
I am so excited to talk about
know.
capability security for an hour.
I know. When we do the episode, I'm just going to replace your avatar with one that's vibrating the entire time.
Uh,
Then we have to get Boops on here and have them talk about uh what was it?
WebAuthn?
WebAuthn. Yes, that's it. That's the thing. Oh my god.
Yeah. uh,
Oh yeah, there's Fuchsia if you want a new operating system,
oh boy, Fuchsia. Ah,
which I think solves basically nothing. I mean, it had some cool ideas, but didn't really solve anything.
yeah, like I do like the idea of having a pervasive interface definition language that's just standardized for all services on the system.
Isn't that Nix?
No, actually, not a configuration language, an interface definition language.
What is an interface definition? Do you mean like the program APIs that are talking to each other?
Uh, yeah. So like, think higher level than the typical APIs. Things that talk about how to encode data to send it across a system request. So
they
like,
have structured data basically.
sort of, yeah. Have you used Swagger slash OpenAPI?
Yeah, like once.
Okay. So imagine a cross between that and Windows's component object model baked into the system to make it super easy to access.
I mean, this just sounds like GraphQL for APIs to me.
I mean, yes, that I am actually considering experimenting of just making as many APIs as possible in a system GraphQL and seeing what happens.
I mean, that seems reasonable to me.
Yeah. Well, we'd probably need to go with a binary serialization format rather than JSON. Maybe we could pull in Ion or something.
I mean, surely, well, yeah, I guess GraphQL is very JSON oriented. We need a binary
Yeah.
interchange format instead.
Right, and I wouldn't want to send the GraphQL source over the wire for every single system call.
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to think about. I mean, I guess at this
Yeah.
point we could also look at Fuchsia's implementation and then see, how we can compare that to what the other operating systems have. But like, you definitely want to embed that into your operating system from the start instead of
Oh yeah,
fucking it up. Which is why
right.
all Windows is still playing catch up with Android with its stupid store and
Right,
terribly
yeah.
implemented at literally everything.
Yeah,
And then Linux has its own problems because like I don't fucking get this where both Windows and Linux can't give me software. And when I say that, I mean Linux can give you software that's old and it's really good at it. Whereas if you want something new on Linux, you're told to go fuck yourself because you have to because if it's not in your package manager and Nix has ways
That's-
around this.
That's just an Ubuntu problem.
No. It is a problem. It is like a Debian, because like there's
Okay,
no,
sure, it's a Debian problem.
Yeah, but
and
like
thus
most
it has infected Ubuntu and Fedora
and everything else. Yeah, like it's a Debian problem. That's all of them basically that anyone uses at this point.
Arch Linux and Nix.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think this is one reason why
I
people
was an
use...
Arch Linux user for years because, well, okay, that's actually a funny story. Because
By the way, I use
laptop,
Arch.
huh?
By the way, I
No.
use Arch.
Yeah, not on purpose. So like, remember that laptop that just didn't have working drivers on Windows?
Yeah.
So because it was a new generation of hardware, it needed a new generation of the drivers, which, well, wasn't terribly complicated. Basically, it just required a header file being patched to inform it that to go from the old generation of the driver to get it supporting the new one, you basically just need to patch a header file to inform it that the version string of this new model is one of the supported cards. And so I tried installing Ubuntu because, easy default, and just found that I couldn't actually do that. And like it would have been a tough one. So I went over to one of my friend's apartments, brought the computer, borrowed their Cinnamon USB stick, and we made a evening of trying to compile this thing and get it to work. Which, let me tell you, it is difficult to patch the Linux kernel source when you don't have a working network connection on the machine. So we did it Bucket Group Brigade style, where we'd download a package on a different computer, move it to the flash drive, plug the flash drive in, mount the flash drive, and install the package off of the flash drive, fetching the header files and trying to patch them and compile them. And after a few hours of trying that, gave up, installed Arch Linux, because Arch Linux is a bleeding edge distribution and you automatically get the latest and greatest software all the time, rather than having the old stuff. Rolling release, bleeding edge distribution. So I followed the instructions, installed it. It worked the first time. Networking came up.
Was it just Arch or was it Antergos? I think it was Antergos.
Just plain Arch.
Because I actually used Antergos, which I think was an Arch distro, or based on it, at one point. And it was very useful for example, when it was in a VM, because it was very lightweight. And it generally worked pretty well. I didn't understand why, but it worked, so I used it. But then Microsoft realized that everyone was used to developing on Linux and put Linux in Windows, and now Linux is doomed.
So yeah, I used Arch for a while, had a few problems with Arch, but overall it was the Linux distribution that actually supported the hardware that I had, and it was fast, it was lean, it had the software I needed, and so I used it despite some of its quirks. And it wasn't freaking Windows. It did not punish me nearly as much as Windows did. And then I found Nix, and I have switched everything over to Nixos now, because it actually solves all of the problems reasonably well. There are still things it needs to work on, but like
its configuration
it is the best
language
I've ever used. Huh?
Like the configuration language.
That is just not even on my list right now. Like,
okay, it's on the list of everyone else who's using Nix.
Yeah, like I'm talking about actual architectural problems, not aesthetic concerns of the language.
Yes, but light users who are not super users care about the aesthetics, not the architectural issues. Unless the architectural...
You can put good aesthetics on a good architecture. You can't turn a bad architecture into a good one without rebuilding.
Yes, but also nobody will use your thing until it has good aesthetics.
Some people will. The super users will.
Well, sometimes it depends.
Yeah. So
like,
yes.
Okay, the problem you run
aesthetics-
into, so like, yes, the super users will do it, but here's the problem: you don't start with a bunch of super users, especially not with Nix, because people have to
Right.
learn how the fuck it works. So the more annoying this is, the fewer people put in the time to even become super users in the first place, which is a legitimate problem that Nix has. Because with Nix, you basically have a group of people. I don't know how many it is. I'd say probably the 10,000 maybe. Maybe 10,000 people on planet Earth have a deep understanding of how Nix actually works.
That's probably an overestimate.
1,000?
Like
300?
Okay, sure.
So 300 people. We are a bus factor of 300. That is terrifying. There are 300 people on this
people
planet.
do you think understand how Windows actually works?
Well, it depends on which part of it. Like I'm talking about like the Nix configuration language part of Nix.
Oh, the Nix configuration language? Then yeah, we're probably looking at tens of thousands.
Okay. That's better.
Yeah.
See, the thing is, Microsoft hires people to understand Windows. That helps a lot. People have to volunteer to subject themselves to Nix.
Yeah. Like things that are on my list for things that Nix needs better solutions for is things like the credential management problem. Because it's really, really convenient to just include credentials for things in the Nix store when you're deploying something to a system. But it's also insecure because the Nix store is world readable, and so your credentials could potentially leak if anyone finds read access to the Nix store. So there are some workarounds with this where you use AugeNix and AGE encrypt your credentials before putting them in the Nix store, and then decrypt them at runtime using the machine keys. But
That's terrifying.
Why?
Just that such a workaround is necessary is kind of terrifying. Because, like, I mean, like you said, the fact that the Nix store is world readable is very problematic.
It's usually not a huge problem.
Until you actually have to care about security, and then it's a problem.
Right, yeah. But, like, for the most part, it's full of software, and you can't... Yeah.
Okay,
most software you can't run... It inherits your permissions.
Yes, that's the problem. Okay, the problem is that...
Well, now we're going to be talking about capability security again. And, like...
But to start with, like, Android starts with contained apps. It starts with that.
Yeah, asterisk, but yes.
Nix builds on top of the Linux problem of security is there's a user and a super user and a gazillion security groups, and then that's it.
Yeah, identity-based security models are just inherently broken by default.
So there's no real way for Nix to get around that issue.
As long as it's still based on Linux anyways.
Yeah. So then you'd have to go to something like Fuchsia or Android where I don't even know what Fuchsia does about this. I just know that Android has better app isolation. But the thing is, Mac actually solved this. And Mac forced everyone into using like app image containerizations, which solves most of these problems. But the reason Apple was able to do that is because Apple can just tell everyone to fucking do something or die because they're Apple. And so nobody else can do this.
Yeah.
Oh, developers are still pissed about what? The app image from Mac thing? I didn't even know. I don't use a Mac, so I have no idea.
Yeah, neither do I.
Hear people who are from the Mac ecosystem talk about how Macs have app images and do a bunch of other things, like just stop supporting architectures or just force developers to do things.
So yeah, really, app image isolation doesn't actually solve the problems. Like, it doesn't actually give us the capability security that's actually needed to make systems actually secure.
Well, it does a lot better job.
Eh, yeah.
I mean, it's a less shit foundation to build on top of. It's still shit. It will still sink eventually, but it sinks slower. The Win32 development model could be better. Even like it, when we talk about backwards compatibility in operating systems, Windows is actually pretty good about that, and Windows has been pretty good about that because they've built up an entire modular shim system that lets them recreate bugs from earlier versions of the operating system that certain apps needs. Whereas Linux is like, haha, what's user space?
But Linux has this whole "we don't break user space" thing.
So here's the
But
thing.
yeah, right. They have
Linus has
one
a
user space. Yeah.
Linus never breaks user space. But then there's the pseudo user space of like all the libraries that people depend on. And those get broken all the time. And people have to do like hard updates and then like just all this
Well,
shit.
yeah, not on Nix anymore because we have yeah, because it crowbars all of that out of there, and now you get immutable packages with immutable dependencies that eventually get garbage collected when they're no longer needed. But you get the exact version of the exact library that you need for this exact app, and no one else has to care about it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Apparently there are developers who basically make you turn off whatever Apple has implemented and then say Apple is better that way. But why the fuck are you using Apple if you just turn everything off?
I
I
don't
can
know,
understand.
something font rendering.
I don't know, but
I don't use Apple. I have used Mac computers. I was issued a Mac laptop at a job once. My parents used Mac laptops and thus gave and made me use one at one point. But like, I'm not an Apple user.
I was forced to use an Apple computer like once when I flew down to visit a friend for a hackathon. And for some reason, I didn't have a laptop at the time. I think my laptop was like out of commission or something else. Um, and so I had to borrow my friend's Apple laptop, and I hated it the entire time. It was just so unintuitive. I hated the keyboard. I hated how everything was different, and like I kept trying to get used to it over the days. Like I didn't just look at it and say, "I hate this is different. I hate it, and I'm not going to use it." I had to use it, so I kept trying and trying to like get used to all these weird bullshit things it was doing, and I came to the conclusion that they were just bad. Like this is a bad thing. You shouldn't do that. It's just dumb.
Yeah.
Third-party apps creating kernel extensions and forcing you to reduce the boot policy security. Why are you using a Mac in that case? Or what? Well, like, why would you use those third-party apps? Like, if you're gonna, I can understand turning shit off in Windows. I do it all the time. But that's because the reason I use Windows is because everything works on it, not because Windows is some paragon of immaculate beauty or something that people apparently think Mac is. So it just confuses the hell out of me why someone would subject
Yeah.
themselves to the Mac ecosystem, which doesn't support anything, doesn't even support OpenGL anymore, at least on some versions, as far from what I know. Doesn't have any games. Like almost everything on a Mac is available somewhere else.
I still find it absolutely hilarious that
you can get better graphics performance out of a Windows game by running it on Linux than on Windows in some cases.
Yeah, that's pretty funny.
Yeah, where if you run it under Wine and cross-compile the DirectX to Vulkan calls running on Linux, even with all of the emulation overhead and and cross-compilation causing optimization paths to not work quite at native performance, it still runs faster and less buggy than it does on Windows.
I mean, I don't think that's really that surprising because
Okay, yeah.
people forget that modern GPU pipelines are entirely about setting up a series of commands for the GPU to run, and then the vast majority of the compute power is then spent on the GPU, just waiting for it to finish doing the draw calls. So a small increase in your efficiency of how your draw calls are sent to the GPU for whatever reason, because you're using Vulkan and you can make more specific restrictions on how things are being optimized, can translate to a significant performance increase that doesn't really, and then it doesn't really matter if the CPU takes a bit longer to submit that command list to the GPU, because it's just, that's not where the bottleneck is anymore. Especially not with indirect commands, because with indirect ones, now you can just tell the GPU to execute something on the GPU from the GPU using information on the GPU, which is real fun.
Yeah. There are some fun things we can do with that.
All right. Anyway, I think we've ranted about how we hate all the operating systems except, I guess, Nix, for long enough.
Yeah. We also talked about how we dislike Nix too. So yeah, we're at an hour. We've talked about all the major operating systems, and we have started running out of things to say a little bit. We could find more things, or we could end the episode. I think we should end the episode.
I think we're plenty done here. I think everyone's got a nice big load of operating systems suck.
Yeah. Join us next time where we'll find something else to explain how every variant of it that currently exists sucks.
Yes, this definitely won't become a recurring theme.